the one source, Sports Card Nation. The hobby is the people. Sports Card Nation.
What is up, everybody? Episode 286. Glad to be back. Hope everyone had a safe and fun Memorial Day weekend with family. Also, took some time to remember those no longer with us who allow us to enjoy those freedoms. All right. Today's guest is back from last week. It's the conclusion of my conversation with author Steve Wiegand, who wrote the book, The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell, which weaves together his career, his 10-year career in the major leagues, baseball cards, and some behind-the-scenes stories. And it's a great book, and we're going to talk more about it on today's episode, which is the conclusion of last week. So if you're listening today, this is part 2, and we'd love it if you go back and listen to part 1. And if you're listening to part 2 because you're listening to part 1, thank you as always. So with that being said, let's get the show started.
For nearly 50 years, Sports Collectors Digest has been the voice of the hobby, bringing you comprehensive coverage of the sports collectible industry. From industry news, auction results, market analysis, and in-depth stories about collectors and their collections, Sports Collectors Digest has everything you need to know about the hobby. SCD is also your leading source for listings of sports collectible dealers, card shops, card shows, and the latest from the industry's top companies. To check out all the latest news or to subscribe to the hobby's oldest magazine, visit sportscollectorsdigest.com or call 1-800-829-5561.
All right, this is part 2 and the conclusion of our great conversation with Steve Wiegand, author of the book, The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell. Like you said, like we talked about, the season ended and he would do other things to earn money. One of them was public speaking. He seemed to enjoy that. He was a talker. I think you'd agree with that. He wasn't shy.
No, not at all.
Sometimes he probably maybe said things that I know he got in kind of a little bit of hot water at different times or another for way he said some things and maybe rubbed people the wrong way. Did that make the fact that he was, outspoken or did these speaking engagements and had these interactions, did that make finding the nuggets for the book, did that make the process easier? I know it's still difficult, but did that help you in getting this book completed?
It did, because first of all, it gave you real insight on what kind of a personality he had, and it backed up what his kids had told me and what other people who knew him had told me. But there were a lot of, he was a fabulous public speaker. He was in big demand. In fact, several of his off seasons, he'd have a job, maybe working for a beer distributorship or something. But usually he didn't go out and peddle beer. He went out and did banquets and talked, and then maybe did a plug for the product at some point. And he got paid for a lot of speaking engagements when they had conventions and things, because he was a very funny guy. If your contemporary listeners and viewers think of Bob Uecker, or a little bit older than that, Joe Garagiola, guys who were funny. He was very self-deprecating. He one time, for an example, he was talking to a bunch of little leaguers, and they asked him what was the best way to play second. He said, "Was it easy to play second base?" He said, "Yeah, just get in front of the ball, let it hit you in the chest, pick it up and throw it." And yet he was actually one of the 2 or 3 best second basemen in the league in terms of fielding. So he was very self-deprecating, but he was also very funny. And like you said, he said what he thought. He was honest, and he wasn't malicious or saying things that just to spout off. But if somebody said, "Do you think the manager could have done a better job?" O'Connell would say, yeah, I think he could have done a better job. I thought he could have used the relief pitchers better. And of course, in those days, even today, but even more so in those days, managers didn't want to hear that stuff. And the front office didn't want to hear that stuff. So he did get in trouble from time to time. But he was such a good guy and such a funny, nice human being that it never lasted because it was never done maliciously.
Yeah, no doubt. And, that's refreshing too, right? Someone that kind of just calls it like he sees it and that sort of thing. And, I don't know if you agree with this and my take too. I don't think he ever played with great managers. I mean, they were people might recognize the names, but I don't think anyone's confusing them with winning pennants or World Series and a Hall of Fame stature. So, maybe some of those critiques and criticisms are sort of warranted based on the track record of some of those managers he played for. He just was maybe a little quicker to point that out than the next guy, but doesn't mean he was wrong.
No, he played for the managers he played for were the kind of guys who got their jobs because they'd been managers for some other team, basically, or they were old players who had the owner of the team liked them, so gave him a shot. And you're right. He wasn't playing for any Bruce Bochy's or Joe Torres or other people like that. His criticism was a lot of times his criticisms were backed up later on by other players, generally after the manager had been fired, and where he was saying it beforehand. But most of the times those things were tempest in teapots. They didn't last very long. It didn't cost him any playing time or any jobs or anything. And I'll give you a quick example. He was playing for Fred Haney in the Braves, and Haney was always praising him for giving 110% and telling the sports writers how great he was and at hustling and trying all the time. Well, there was a game one day in 1956, I think it was. Right, he didn't run out. He had a ground ball to the first base to the pitcher, and the pitcher threw it to the first baseman. And O'Connell didn't run it out. He ran about 2/3 of the way down the line. Well, the first baseman dropped it. It ran up his arm and dropped it. And so if O'Connell had run hard, he would have been safe. So he got back to the dugout, and Haney said, "I'm going to fine you $100 for not running that ball out. You didn't run halfway." And O'Connell grinned and said, "Oh, come on, Fred. I ran 2/3 of the way." So Haney laughed and said, "Okay, I'm going to fine you $60 for every foot that you ran." So that was the kind of thing he did. So
yeah, and I mean, it's all speculation. Do you think if he would have had played for maybe a better quality of manager or managers, you think his career would have been any different, or you think it not necessarily?
I don't know about the managers, but I think his career would have been, and maybe this is the managers because they made the decisions. If he'd have been able to stay at third base, they said, "Look, you're a third baseman. You're going to play third base. You're going to play it like Ken Boyer or Greg Nettles or Arenado, and you're going to be a third baseman." I think that would have solidified it would have made him more confident as a hitter because he wasn't trying to learn a different position. And I think that would have been a real boost for him. But that gets back to what you said about the managers, because that was a manager. They had a hold at shortstop. They moved him to shortstop. They had a hold at second base. They moved him to second base. And then, criticized if he didn't learn how to turn the double play the first week he was there. So I think that probably hurt him somewhat.
Yeah, stability is important. Anyone who's played sports can tell you if they've had to switch positions, it can be difficult. You're seeing the balls off the bat at a different angle. You make a great point with double play turns change. You're now in a different position. You're catching the ball in a different spot, pivoting a different sort of way. And like you said, he pretty much went right around the infield from third to short to second, right. And back again at different times. Reading the book too, he played for temperamental sort of managers where you had an 0 for 4 day, and they immediately you sat for a whole week before you saw the field again. Yeah, and that's a tough pressure to play in, like thinking, man, if I don't have a halfway decent day today, I may be not playing for a week or potentially more. I think that makes you nervous, and that's not a comfortable situation to be in. Then there's a story, as your book points out, there were other players that played in front of him where they had too long of a leash, and like you had the better player watching rather than playing, and so
Right.
he had some of that sort of adversity that didn't help his matters. But yeah, again, strung 10 years in the big leagues based on some of those other intangibles and whatnot. From when you decided to that he was the subject of your book to its completion, how long of a process was that for you?
It was probably about where I was actually working on the book was probably a little less than 2 years. I sold the idea to my publisher, which is Bancroft Press, and they said, "Yeah, okay, we see what you're going with it, so go ahead and do it." And I got the contract, and then it was a matter of I looked at his career. I went through, his career kind of cursory at first, and then talked to his kids, talked to a few other people, and then I thought, you got to flush this out with more than just his. And in 1955 he did this, and in 1956 he did this, and I'd gotten onto the whole idea of him in the first place from looking at cards. So I wanted to kind of look at the history of cards, and I wanted to throw that as an element, and then I wanted to put in the kind of what the situation was while he was playing, because they made a fair amount of money compared to the average American in the 1950s, but they were totally they were slaves basically. They couldn't. He was playing with the Pirates. He couldn't end his contract at the end of the year and then go to another team. He could be traded without any say at all. The way it worked in those days is if you were cut and you had signed a contract, you got a 30-day paycheck and a train ticket home. That's all the security that you had. So I wanted to put in the fact that, this is what was going on in the country at the time. He lost 2 years. He finished third in the Rookie of the Year voting in the National League in 1950. 1951, he was drafted and he missed all of the 51 and 52 seasons. So, there he is right at the very start of his career, very promising, and he loses 2 years. Now that happened to guys like Mays and other people as well. But still, it's the kind of thing that today's players don't face. And so that was another sword over his head, I guess. So in terms of looking through the book, the fun thing and the unfun thing was, and your younger viewers and readers, listeners won't maybe relate to this, but when I was a kid, one of the great joys of a newspaper was going through and looking at the box scores. And you'd pick out players and you'd follow what they did and you'd read the little summary of the game. I went through every box score of every game that he played in for 10 years. And that meant spending 3 weeks in the Milwaukee Central Library because their newspapers weren't online at the time. So that means grinding through their system to look at every box score. And it was fun, but it was also not fun at certain times. So
yeah, it was a grind. You mentioned the grind. That's a grind, right? Yeah. In today's digital age where everything's almost at your fingertips to do it the old school way. And right. I'm old enough, Steve. We got the local games being in New York City, Yankees, Mets, and that sort of thing. But anyone else, you had to get that paper the next day and read the box scores. And like you said, yeah, we had our favorite players, even on other teams that we weren't a fan
right.
of the team, but we were fond of the player. And so hearing you talk about that, I know I lived it. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Doing it in the moment is funner than having to go backtrack and do it, 10 years worth all in kind of one sum. So that's a whole nother show. Was there any moment, the book's out, were there any moments where you yourself, you can say this now, like did I pick? Am I barking up the right tree? Did you second guess yourself at any time, or not really?
Oh yeah, this is my 10th book, and there's always that moment at least once. And in this one, it was you get about halfway through his career, and he hit kind of a low point. And you said, okay, I've already said that he's a great fielder. I've already said that he has all these intangibles. The guy's hitting 239. What am I going to say nice about the guy? And that became a little bit of at that point I thought, I really may not be able to justify this. I mean, it may be that somebody's going to get halfway through this book and say, so this is it. He never does anything dramatic. He never saves the pennant or does anything like that. But then you get over that. And then when the finish line gets in sight, you start getting excited about it. And, you start thinking about what does this all mean and how does it wrap up? And I'll tell you a story, John. It's a little bit off the point, but
go ahead.
In 1989, I was covering the World Series between the Giants and the A's, and I was down on the field before the first game, and the Giants had a pitcher named Bob Nepper who had come over he'd had a pretty good career with Houston. He'd come over and he was getting up there, and it was either his last year or his next to last year. And I don't even think he was on the active roster for the Giants. And so I was talking to him about the importance. It was his first World Series, and I was talking to him about, how did he feel about it? And he said, look, this is what you play for. I don't care. You sign the contract and you argue with the guys about whether you should get more money and how many walks you had and what your earned run averages was. But you really, when you get on the field like this is what you're here for, is to play a game and play a baseball game. And you pinch yourself all the time thinking, I'm got a uniform on and a glove, and I get to play a kid's game and I get paid for it. And this is terrific. And I thought that sort of caught the whole idea of, and maybe it's been lost a little bit. I certainly hope not, but it's been lost a little bit in both being a baseball fan and watching the game, and in card collecting. And I'll get on my soapbox here a little bit, and I'll sound like an old fart for doing it, but I watch from time to time. I watch YouTube videos of maybe a pack opening, or somebody has just bought a box at a Goodwill and they're looking through them. And I was watching one the other day. The guy was going through the cards, and every card he went through, he mispronounced them. These were cards from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He mispronounced the name. I mean, grossly mispronounced the name. Didn't have a clue who the guy was. And when he got to Carl Yastrzemski, he didn't know. It was clear he didn't know who Carl Yastrzemski was, other than he had a list there he had a Beckett or some kind of list of who was a valuable card from that year. But here he is with a Hall of Famer, and he doesn't know the guys. He clearly didn't know who the guy was. And as an old guy, it's a little troubling because you can pick up any pack from today or 50 years ago, and there's a story behind the picture on each of those cards. And it's, how this guy, like you said before, was the star athlete in his high school and maybe 3 sports, dominated in baseball, maybe went through 3 years in the minor leagues where he was a star, gets to the majors, and that's it. He's peaked. He maybe has 2 or 3 good years. He's up and down a little bit, and he's gone. But the rest of his life, he's going to say, yeah, I was a big league ball player. And, how many of us who like baseball or love baseball can say that, that we even got anywhere close to that. So I hope if people read the book and they'll pick up on the fact that there was nothing wrong with being a 260 lifetime hitter. And if you enjoyed what you did, you did the best you could. So.
Yeah, no, and the book is great at put, like you said, it's it says the tale of baseball card average players and the true value of America's game, and you weaved all of that stuff together so well, Steve. And we always want people want to talk about those stars, but you can't have a whole roster of Mickey Mantles, right? You needed those, or Willie Mays. You needed those other role players those utility guys, those semi-stars, if you will, those intangible guys, those hustlers to fill out the roster. And sometimes I don't think they get enough credit. It's easy. The low-hanging fruit is those superstars. And I'm with you when I see, Carl Yastrzemski is a Hall of Famer. You really should probably know the name almost at any age. I mean, unless you're very young, I get that. But, that's one of my pet peeves in sports and life and in the hobbies is not – I'm a history guy. I love history across different genres, not just world history, but sports history, card history. That's just my thing. And so one of my pet peeves, it might be a little unfair, is when someone else doesn't sort of respect that or realize that everything is the bridge to the next era, whether you like it or not. We wouldn't be where we are today without what happened yesterday or 5 years ago,
right.
10 years ago. And so, yeah, that always is a pet peeve of mine too. And again, you do a great job of highlighting it. The book is, while it is about Danny O'Connell, it's about baseball. It's about sports. It's about the struggle to stay at that level and fight and claw and, in the off season to fight and claw to pay the bills and get to the next season. And I don't think that's talked about enough, again. And I that's one thing I loved about what you did. And again, even some of the bubblegum wars with the cards and Bowman and Tops, you interweave that in there, which is very important because that's part of the fabric as well at that time. And you talk about getting lots of Danny O'Connell cards and not as many Willie Mays, and who you didn't realize it then, but it led to this book.
You are listening to the Sports Card Nation podcast. We'll be right back after this break.
Hobby Hotline is the hobby's only live interactive call-in show. Join some of your favorite hobby personalities every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, to discuss the hottest hobby topics. If you miss us live, catch us after the fact on all major podcast platforms. Follow us on socials at Hobby Hotline.
We are back.
Talk about, coming down the home stretch here, kind of talk about your hobby as a kid and where those cards. I know I spoke to you before we hit record, but kind of, again, speak to like your collecting background there.
Well, I started, I was living, I grew up in San Diego, but for a couple of years when my dad was overseas in the Navy, I lived in Monterey near San Francisco. The Giants happened to come to San Francisco the year I first started thinking about baseball. So I was a big Giants fan. And we moved to San Diego. I was still a Giants fan. Baseball cards kind of caught my attention about the same time I started getting an allowance from my parents. And I thought, I got a quarter every week here. I can do something with this. So I would go up and buy, a Coke or a candy bar or something, and I'd buy a couple of baseball card packs. And it kind of took off from there. That became my hobby. I wanted to get as many baseball cards as I could. And I did all the things that everybody else did at that age. We did flipping. We did flipping against the wall. We did flipping to see if they came down odds or evens. We traded cards. I took all my Dodger cards and put them in the spokes of my bicycle. Much to my regret now, because I think there was some Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale in there, but
yeah.
But I was a Giants fan, so I collected for till I was in my early teens, I think. And then guess what happened to them? I found out about girls, and all my cards went to the kid next door who was 8 or 9 years old, and then I started again in the early 80s when interest kind of took off. There wasn't just Topps anymore. There was Upper Deck and there was other manufacturers putting cards out. And I wasn't so interested in those. I was more interested in the old cards. So I started collecting Giants cards, Topps Giants, from 51, the first issue, through the early 2000s, I guess. And that's basically what I did. And I'd go to card shows and I'd, look for, I didn't really care about condition. I wasn't looking for, a PSA 8 of Philippe Alou or somebody. I just wanted to complete the set. And that's what I did. When I retired from newspapering and we moved from California to Arizona, I had a good friend who had two grandsons who were 7, 8, 9 years old, avid little leaguers, avid baseball fans. And so I took out a few cards. So I still probably have maybe a couple of dozen cards. And by the way, I've got about 50 Danny O'Connell cards if anybody's interested. So I gave my collection to them. And I was really pleased that they continued. There were cards I was missing, and they were continuing to save their allowances and try to complete their card set. So anyway, that's what happened to them. And that's what I think should happen to them. I think if you're a card collector and you're no longer active in it, find somebody, sell them if you need to, but if otherwise, find some kid who needs to get into the sport and into the hobby and collect cards.
Yeah, and pass that baton and that next generation behind us that are going to carry that torch forward and so on and so on. That was nice of you, Steve, and hopefully that's a story that will continue, and that's also how we remember these players sometimes,
right?
Through cardboard, right? I mean, I remember even as when I was a kid, getting a card of a player I hadn't heard of, and sort of like, who's he? What's he about? What kind of year did he? And you start learning more about him, And back then, you very well know too, Topps put those cartoons on the back that talked about some of the off the field stuff. So and so does this in the off season. So and so, collects stamps or in his spare time. We learned about the person behind the uniform, not just
right.
the stats, and I think that's important. And again, Danny O'Connell was a man beside a baseball player. And that book talks a lot about that. And
it's funny you talk about the cartoons, though. That I always used to laugh as I was collecting them as an adult, because you could generally look at the little cartoon on the back of the Topps card, and you could tell how good the player was, because if he was a really good player, it would say something like Eddie made his 4th All-Star team last year. But if he wasn't good, it would say John enjoys bowling in the off season.
It's a great point. That's how you gauged what level. Mickey won the 1953 MVP.
Right.
He said, Mikey likes to garden.
Yeah, right.
So, but it is a great point, and but it's also, I used it as a younger kid when those really were in full force. I used it to learn sort of about these guys off the field as well as on, and some of that I think is lost. You mentioned this, or I think it's a little bit lost in today's game and today's collectors or fans, but there's still people who care and research that stuff, and not writing a book as well. And
I tell. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
I tell collectors who maybe guys are buying wax packs, or maybe they're buying sets, and you get a common card now, and you never heard of the guy. He plays for some team you don't follow. Do yourself a favor, and we can do it now with the web. Google the guy. You'll find I guarantee you that his parents or his girlfriend or somebody has put up a Wikipedia article on the guy. And you might find out that, hey, he went to your high school, or maybe he likes to surf in his off season, and you used to like to surf in your off season. You'll find something interesting about the guy. And maybe it takes a little of the sting out of getting a pack full of commons, or, nothing that's, particularly interesting or valuable. But it'll really extend your interest in the game, I think, as well. Because then you're watching the guy play against your favorite team, and you say, I know that guy. I know something about him.
Yeah, it brings that human element back into
Right.
it. That these, they put their pants on. While they might be better baseball, football, basketball, whatever sport players than us, they also put their pants on one leg at a time. And I think it's important to know that and learn about it. Your book does a great job. For those, if you haven't read it yet, The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell. This is not just a book. I know I've said this numerous times because it's important. While it is about Danny O'Connell, there's much more going on in this book. You got a lot of behind the scenes baseball stories, a lot of anecdotes. You've got the the base for hobbyists. You've got the baseball card element in there as well. It's a great read. Like I said, I had a hard time putting it down in a couple late nights where I stayed up a little later than I probably should have. Before we close it out, I guess do you see another? I know you're writing 2 books. You said concurrently. You think you'll come back to the sports arena with a book somewhere in the future? You think it's somewhere you want to go again?
I hope so. I do think I actually had an idea just recently for another baseball-oriented book. So I'm going to explore that quite a bit as I move on down the road.
Well, I'd love to see it. Again, this book was tremendous. And like I said, I'm not always a voracious reader, but this one made me a voracious reader because I was, it was like, I want to find out what happens now or what's next. And especially when you don't know about a player, right? We know a lot about some of the bigger names. This was almost more interesting, as crazy as that might sound. Steve, I want to give, I always give the guests sort of the final word, where people can find the book, purchase the book, your other books, websites, social media, anything you want to share with those listening out there. Take all the time you need and get that information.
Okay, well, not much. The book will be out in hardcover in the middle of July. In fact, the release date is set for the day of the All-Star game this year.
There you go.
So it'll be out in hardcover from Bancroft Press, and you can buy it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any place you can buy new books. If you Google my name or go on Amazon and do my name, you'll find it and all the other books, and you can order an advance copy if you want to.
Yeah, and if you follow me on social media, make sure to let me know, Steve. I'll gladly retweet, get that word out there. And
okay, great. I appreciate that.
Someone who's read the book and know what it's about and how interesting and important it is. Gladly share that so other people can be enlightened as well. Well, I appreciate you coming on, making some time for us. And again, great book. Again, read it rather quick. That's always a sign to me that I'm enjoying it. The book that I'm sort of forcing myself to read, like I got to read another chapter. Usually that's a school book, but
I remember those days.
But no, awesome book, and I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of the behind the scenes to how a book comes together and some of the processes and difficulties. Everyone thinks it's I just start writing stuff. It's not as simple as that. So
well, thanks, John. I appreciate you having me on, and really enjoyed our talk. And hope people buy the book.
Yeah, no doubt. Like I said, we'll get the word out there for sure. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John.
All right, that concludes our conversation with Steve. I want to thank him for allowing me to read an advance copy of that book and then coming on the show and talking about it. It's a great read if you're a baseball fan, even a card collector and a semi-baseball fan. Just super interesting. Had a hard time putting it down at the times that I did. Got through it quickly because I wanted to see what was going to happen next. I learned a lot about Danny O'Connell, and those guys were so, like I said during the interview, so important to the fabric of the game. You can't have 26 Mickey Mantles on a team. You have to have those guys that fill those roles, and a great defensive player as well. And that book is going to come out around the Major League Baseball All-Star break, so go pick up a copy. And look at the blurbs. You might see a familiar name on that as well. So with that being said, we're going to hear from our Hobbies the People announcer, some closing thoughts, and put the bow tie on this week's episode.
Time for our Hobby is the People announcer of the week.
Hello, we are
Graham,
Rory,
Annie,
and we are
Lakeside Collectibles.
Please remember,
The hobby is the people.
If you'd like to be the Hobby is the People announcer of the week, do a WAV or MP3 file and send it to sportscardnationpc@gmail.com.
That's a wrap for this week. Huge thanks to you, the listeners out there, because without you, there is no us. If you like the show, we truly appreciate positive reviews. Big ups to our great guests who drive the show and our awesome sponsors who make it all possible. Sports Card Nation will be back next week, but don't forget to catch either Hobby Quick Hits or Card Mentions coming up on Monday. I'll leave you with this. How do we change the world? One random act of kindness at a time. Remember, the hobby is the people.
Hobby News Daily is your homepage of the hobby, providing original writing, exclusive gem rate data, a daily morning minute podcast, and some of the best content creators in the hobby. Remember, hobbynewsdaily.com and @hobbynewsdaily on social. Happy collecting!
Iron Sports Cards is your #1 source for all your PSA and other grading submissions. Their elite status improves turnaround times. Heck, they even provide the card savers. Their chat rooms provide updates on all your submissions. They also offer wax options and single cards to cover all the bases. Check them out on Facebook at Iron Sports Cards Group or on the web at ironsportscards.com, or even give them a call at 1-877-IRON-PSA. Rob's got you covered.